Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ117, Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 14, where we're going to take a look at combating terrorism. And just like the other chapters previous to this one, there is quite a bit of content. So let's go ahead and just jump right into our lecture this morning. So the purpose of this chapter, what we're going to discuss today, is to number one, explain the difference between national security policy and national security strategy, and also number two, to introduce the concepts, and we'll define these terms as well, that being anti-terrorism and counterterrorism. So policy and strategy are often used synonymously, but they're really not the same. Our national security policy represents the goals the United States intends to accomplish, while our national security strategy are the actions that we are going to take to ensure that our national security policies are achieved. Now, our national security policies and strategies have faced unusually strong challenges in recent decades. And to kind of illustrate this, North Korea and Iran both have nuclear ambitions. Russia makes smaller Eastern European countries nervous. China, with a modern naval fleet, is basically asserting its presence. And the advent of lone wolf terrorists continue to threaten our sense of security. So we have a lot to kind of think about as it relates to both our national security policy and also the strategy, right? Now, like policy, strategy formulation is part art and somewhat scientific, in that it follows certain patterns that require an understanding of terminology, adherence to certain principles, and also a process that must be creative and disciplined at the same time. Now, strategy formulation models don't work like formulas because really life situations, they kind of vary, right? According to time and place and other variables, meaning that things are always kind of moving and changing. Nevertheless, strategy formulation models provide a means to managing the complexities of different situations. Now, in your textbook on page 389, there's a chart there that basically summarizes a strategy formulation framework that can be used to determine how we combat terrorism, as well as some other purposes. And there are some elements that are built into the model. And I didn't make an independent slide for each one of these because you don't have to know all of the ins and outs, but I wanted you to take a look at the actual strategy. And it really starts with the purpose, the national purpose, the enduring values and beliefs that are embodied in our national purpose represent the legal, philosophical, and the moral basis for our country. We have national interests, which would be next. We have a strategic vision, and all of these are in your textbook if you want to look them up. We have national policy. We also have the strategy formulation process, and here we are right here if you're following along. We have the feasibility and acceptability, which is right down in here. And then finally, we have the risk assessment. So this is kind of the strategy formulation framework. Now, over the past 2 decades, the United States has improved its capabilities to address domestic and transnational terrorism, including protecting the U.S. interests abroad. And 2 short definitions of very important elements of fighting terrorism are going to be anti-terrorism and counterterrorism, and we're actually going to define these as well. Now, many, but not all, anti-terrorism activities are carried out by units of local and state governments, as well as non-military organizations of the federal government and private contractors. Local and state governments often have units with counterterrorism in their titles. But these types of units are usually perform anti-terrorism duties. And this may happen for a couple of reasons, and we'll take a look at that. But let's first define these two phrases. So what do you think anti-terrorism is by definition? Well, we can do something really simple, which is probably what you're doing right now. You could Google it, and you could, type in the words anti-terrorism, and you would get kind of an interesting definition, right? The prevention or abatement, meaning kind of removal of terrorism. Well, that's kind of generic, I mean, in a sense. So it's a little bit broader than that. So here's a definition. So anti-terrorism would be defensive actions taken to reduce the vulnerability of people and property to terrorist attacks, including rapid containment by local military and civilian forces. So that's a definition of anti-terrorism. Now, just something that's worth noting. Note that anti-terrorism programs, they also, even though they're defensive typically in nature, they also have a proactive component of engaging in activities that are intended to prevent an attack or reduce the losses caused by one, and a reactive component of managing the aftermath of an attack. But typically, anti-terrorism would be defensive actions. So, there's a little bit of, kind of just like FEMA typically responds to things afterwards. So, but yet they do have something that's proactive, right? They have the training and the programs and the resources and things like that. Well, anti-terrorism is kind of along that same path, where while it is defensive in nature, it also has a proactive component that's built into it. So just, kind of understand that. As compared to counterterrorism. Now, you could look this one up, in the dictionary as well, or online, which is probably what you're doing. And this talks about political or military activities that are designed to prevent or thwart or stop terrorism. By definition, though, it would be counterterrorism would be offensive, meaning not offensive like I take offense to that, but on the offense. So these would be offensive actions, usually military or paramilitary, and these actions are taken to prevent, deter, or respond to terrorist threats or attacks. And typically agencies like the CIA, the Department of Defense, and the U.S. Special Operations Command are typically involved in a lot of these different counterterrorism type activities, if you will. So another chart that you can find on page 391 in your textbook kind of gives you a little bit of, it helps the definitions that we just talked at. So you have here, anti-terrorism versus counterterrorism. So anti-terrorism, remember, it's defensive typically, and it's used to reduce the vulnerability to terrorist attacks. Now, we know there's a proactive component, but typically it's defensive, whereas counterterrorism are more offensive measures, meaning we're going to act on something first, and these are done to prevent, deter, and respond to terrorism. So again, you can find this chart on page 391 in your textbook. So again, many but not all anti-terrorism activities, are carried out by units of local and state governments, as well as non-military organizations of the federal government and private contractors, because local and state governments often have these units, and they're titled counterterrorism. But typically, they usually perform the standard anti-terrorism duties, right? The more defensive measures, and hopefully that kind of makes sense to everyone. So, and this unit you're going to see right here in New York PD, they have their own counterterrorism unit. Now, New York is one of the largest policing agencies in the United States, so their unit is a little bit proactive, although they do engage in a lot of defensive measures as well, but they also have a proactive component built into their unit as well. And then you can see the Department of Homeland Security, of course, has a counterterrorism unit. And we'll talk about a few other units during this lecture that assist in these anti-terrorism and also counterterrorism activities. So now let's take an kind of an overview of anti-terrorism. So a complete definition of anti-terrorism is basically the defensive actions, again, taken to reduce the vulnerability of people and property to terrorist acts, to include rapid containment by local military and civilian forces. Now, note that anti-terrorism programs, again, they do have that proactive component built in of engaging in activities that are intended to prevent an attack or reduce the losses caused by one, and a reactive component of managing the aftermath of an attack. And again, many countries have anti-terrorism programs. South Korea and Israel have particularly robust, if you will, anti-terrorism programs, largely because they both have borders with countries that are basically opposed to their existence, right? So if you were to look at a map of Israel, all of the countries that are around Israel really don't want them to be there. So that's why both their anti-terrorism and their counterterrorism units are pretty bolstered pretty high. So America's anti-terrorism program has been characterized as being geographically limited to the United States, so mostly within the U.S. However, this isn't totally accurate. The U.S. Department of State's Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program, called ATAP, I know, another acronym, they train personnel in friendly foreign countries in such topics as protecting critical infrastructures, cybersecurity, dignitary protection, terrorist interdiction, countering violent extremism, and handling improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. And in any typical year, the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program provides over 500 courses in over 50 countries. Now, some of the countries served would include the Philippines, Colombia, Kenya, Mexico, Peru, Bahrain, and some countries in the Caribbean. So now what we want to do is we want to look at, some of the American anti-terrorism agencies or organizations, and we'll look at what they actually do. And the basic concepts of anti-terrorism programs can be seen on the following chart that I'm going to show you, and then we're going to take a look at some of these actual organizations. So what we have here is an anti-terrorism program chart. And it kind of shows you exactly how the planning and training, the proactive element and prevention also figure into this. So on page 393 in your textbook, it's marked chart or figure 14-4. And again, it talks about the proactive and reactive portions of anti-terrorism programs and exactly how they're depicted. So let's kind of get into this a little bit. So, again, what we're going to talk about, now would be some of the American anti-terrorism organizations and what they do. And remember that for each agency that we look at, one or more examples of its anti-terrorism activities are going to be covered. So we'll talk about a few of these as we kind of go through. So let's take a look at some of these broad agencies. So the first would be the U.S. Department of Treasury. And you're probably thinking, okay, that's weird. Isn't like the U.S. Department of Treasury like money? Well, yeah, but remember a lot of these agencies, and we've talked about it, they're not just one-dimensional. So the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, and that's important because these groups need money to run, right? So this organization here is led by an undersecretary. And this unit is responsible for the department's twin goals, meaning more than one, of safeguarding the financial system against illicit use, illegal use, and combating rogue nations, terrorist facilitators, weapons of mass destruction, proliferators, money launderers, drug kingpins, and other national security threats. So there's a lot that kind of go into this. So, again, goal number one is to safeguard the financial system against illicit or illegal use. And the second goal, again, is to combat these rogue nations, terrorists, the ones that are, that deal with WMDs, money laundering, drug kingpins, and other national security threats. And an example of that would be from 2001 to 2011. There were 7 charity groups that were actually determined to be funding terrorist groups. So you can see that we do need someone to kind of keep an eye on that. So the intelligence and enforcement functions are executed by several units, including the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the Executive Office for Asset Forfeiture. But again, we're talking about those charities that were actually fundraising, if you will, for for terrorist organizations. And a couple of those organizations were both Al-Qaeda and Hamas, as a couple of examples. So the next organization that we'll look at briefly will be the FBI, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, the FBI's mission statement is to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution of the United States. The FBI, and we should know this by now, is the lead agency for the Foreign Terrorist Tracking Task Force, which was created by Homeland Security Presidential Directive 2 back in 2001. And it directed federal agencies to cooperate in an effort to do, 1, deny entry of aliens into the United States associated with or suspected of being engaged in or supporting terrorism. So they have to meet that qualification. Or 2, to locate, detain, and prosecute and deport any such individuals already present in the United States. So they're not just going around, this task force doesn't just go around grabbing, those that might have entered the country illegally and throwing them out, because what I read to you is that there's these qualifiers. So this lead agency, this Foreign Terrorist Tracking Task Force, Again, part of their job is to deny entry of those individuals that want to come into the U.S. that are associated with or suspected of terrorist activity. And then again, part of their job is to locate, detain, prosecute, and remove from the country those that are involved in terrorist activity, etc., but they're already here. So it's kind of a two-prong approach. So that's a little bit about the FBI as it relates to combating terrorism under the realm of anti-terrorism and counterterrorism. So now let's take a look at Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. So in the Department of Homeland Security, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Unit, or ICE, has a terrorist tracking and pursuit group that identifies non-immigrants who have overstayed the terms of their admission and who may pose a potential risk or threat to national security. Now, the terms of their admission is defined as admissions to the United States for business or pleasure, academic or vocational study, temporary employment, or to act as a representative of a foreign government or international organization. So, again, this particular group, similar to the FBI, their job is to deal with those individuals that are suspected of being a terrorist, involved in a terrorist organization, supporting a terrorist organization, or those that might pose a credible threat to national security. And on page 394 in your textbook, there's a chart that you can see here. This is the process after a person is considered that national security threat. So it kind of goes, it starts here in the upper left, and it's the identification of the national security threat. The project is established, the data search criteria generated, the threat assessment is basically developed. There's the analysis portion. Then they start to look at the potential threats that are identified. That information is passed on or disseminated to the field headquarters, and the subject and the threat information are addressed by the field office. There's either going to be action or no action, and then the field office is going to provide that response. So that's kind of how it basically moves through. So again, that would be the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. So this is a flow chart again that depicts what happens after an individual is identified as a person considered a national security threat. What about state and local law enforcement? Well, we know that they are involved in anti-terrorism, right? So, at the local and state level, American state and local law enforcement agencies really have an important role to play in anti-terrorism. They truly do. Local law enforcement has been basically identified or cast as the kind of the eyes and ears on the front lines of anti-terrorism and counterterrorism efforts. And states and large cities are ordinarily members of Joint Terrorism Task Force. Remember, we learned that phrase, the JTTF. Remember, I talked about one when I was working in Rialto, where there was an office of the FBI in Riverside, and we had a liaison officer from our department that was part of that JTTF task force. But some departments also have their own counterterrorism units, which actually perform more defensive anti-terrorism tasks as opposed to, being involved in executing offensive type operations. And that really, remember, it falls to the kind of paramilitary or the military for the most part on those, offensive type operations. So New York City, as I mentioned before, several times a target of terrorist attacks has made probably the largest American municipal commitment to combating terrorism, with more than 1,000 officers assigned to various specialized counterterrorism units, as they're titled, some of whom are assigned abroad, meaning out of the country. And we talked a little bit about that in previous chapters. Now, the New York Police Department's counterterrorism program, it really is pretty, sophisticated. It's not just kind of a general program, but this gives you an idea of how state and local law enforcement are also involved in combating terrorism. So next we have the U.S. Attorney's Office. So across the country, every United States Attorney's Office has substantial responsibility for combating both domestic and international terrorism. Now, one way that responsibility gets expressed is through an anti-terrorism advisory council, each headed by a U.S. attorney, and with a wide-ranging membership, including individuals from, let's say, the National Guard, state and local and federal law enforcement agencies, etc. And this anti-terrorist advisory council also seeks to deter, detect, and prevent future attacks within the United States by creating partnerships that do a couple of things. One would be to coordinate anti-terrorism activities. Two, to initiate and support anti-terror training programs. And then finally, three, to facilitate information sharing across all levels of government. So this, again, would be the U.S. Attorney's Office. And then, of course, TSA. Remember, we're talking about combating terrorism, so this is one of the agencies that should probably come right to the forefront, right? So we covered TSA in a little more detail back in Chapter 11. So, kind of keep in mind that Homeland Security, only a brief statement is kind of needed here about the Transportation Security Administration. So TSA is responsible for securing the transportation systems and freedom of movement on these systems for people and commerce. And we talked a little bit about, federal air marshals. That group is one of the kind of the enforcement arms, if you will, of TSA. And they are responsible for primarily securing, aviation transportation assets and commercial airliners, both domestic and international. And again, kind of an interesting fact, the exact number of air marshals isn't made public. And reason for that would be for security reasons, because we don't want everybody to know how many individuals are out there. So another interesting department would be the U.S. Department of Energy. So and you're probably thinking about the first one we started talking earlier when we talked about the Department of Treasury, and we're kind of going, huh? And now we're going to talk about the Department of Energy. So under the Atomic Energy Act, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, is responsible for investigating illegal activities involving the use of nuclear materials within the United States. So now you're probably going, now I know why it's under the U.S. Department of Energy. And this includes terrorist threats concerning the use of nuclear materials. So the National Nuclear Security Administration has a number of assets related to a potential nuclear incident. In a terrorist type situation, there's a group called the Nuclear Emergency Support Team. Can search for and identify nuclear materials, assess potential nuclear devices, render such devices safe, and then package these devices for transportation to a place of final destination in order to be disposed of. So these, kind of cool, these nuclear emergency support teams, they consist of 5 to several dozen individuals or specialists, depending upon the situation. And when we talk about terrorism involving a nuclear device is both a public concern and a focus of the federal government. So again, we're saying, well, the Department of Energy, well, okay, we know that nuclear falls under Department of Energy. Remember, we talked about critical infrastructure. So without trying to go back too far into previous lectures, but knowing that we have nuclear capabilities and other individuals are trying to obtain this is one of the reasons that we have this particular agency here. And here's a picture, if you will, of those nuclear emergency support teams. Remember, I talked about them, and again, they have acronyms like everything else. They're called NEST teams, and they can search for and identify materials, assess the devices, see if they're real or not, render them safe, meaning make it so they won't activate, explode, etc., and then move them to their final destination site for destruction or disposition, etc. Okay, so another larger agency that we want to talk about, and we're still kind of all under the anti-terrorism umbrella here. And I know we're talking about a lot of different things, but we're going to talk about U.S. NORTHCOM Command, or U.S. Northern Command. They call it NORTHCOM for short. So the U.S. Northern Command, or NORTHCOM, has much wider responsibilities than just anti-terrorism, such as directing the entire North American Aerospace Defense Command. But those other important responsibilities really we'll kind of talk about later. So established in 2002, NORTHCOM's area of responsibility for securing the United States includes land, air, and sea approaches to all 48 continental states, Alaska, Hawaii, Canada, and Mexico. And NORTHCOM also directs the U.S. Department of Defense's Homeland Security efforts and the planning, organizing, and execution of military support to civil authorities. Now, NORTHCOM is not directly involved in basic law enforcement activities, if you will. So an easy way of thinking about the relationship between NORTHCOM and civilian authorities is that NORTHCOM is responsible for accurately identifying and quickly deploying to civilian agencies the right amount and mix, etc., of Department of Defense assets to address natural and man-made disasters. And this type of assistance does not violate the federal Posse Comitatus Act because NORTHCOM is directly involved in is not directly involved in law enforcement activities. So their job is to get the stuff there. And that'll probably, so now you can differentiate between what basic law enforcement does compared to what NORTHCOM is involved in. And NORTHCOM established the Joint Task Force North in 2004 to assist local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies in protecting the border between Mexico and the United States, reasoning that reducing the number of illegal border crossers diminishes the opportunity for terrorists and weapons of mass destruction to enter the country. And that kind of makes sense, right? In 2010, NORTHCOM worked closely with the Canadian government to provide athletes and visitors to the 2010 Vancouver Olympics. I believe it was the Winter Olympics, which was beneficial to the protection of both countries, again, from terrorist attacks. So NORTHCOM is kind of the supplier. But remember, they also have all of that area that that they're responsible for. And NORTHCOM also sets the level of force protection at the Department of Defense, installations, facilities, and units within their area of responsibility. And that would be Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. So again, they set the level of force protection for the Department of Defense. Now, force protection, by definition, is an anti-terrorism effort defined as the preventative measures taken to mitigate hostile actions against the Department of Defense, personnel and families, resources, facilities, and critical information. And here is kind of it's a chart that shows where what falls underneath NORTHCOM, if you will. And you can see here, you have the president, kind of at the top of this hierarchy. Then you have the Secretary of Defense, and then you have some of these bureaus and units here, and it goes all the way down to here. And then you can see the lines coordinating, supporting, etc. And then here's another kind of interesting. So here you can see NORTHCOM, what they're responsible for. And there's different areas and there's different units, if you will. These different agencies are responsible for these different areas. So here you can see this is SOUTHCOM, right? Kind of makes sense. And this would be NORTHCOM. So everything in this green is going to be responsible by U.S. NORTHCOM. Okay, and then finally, before we get to counterterrorism, we'll talk briefly about the Marine Corps. So among the U.S. Marine Corps, anti-terrorism units is the chemical, biological, and immediate response force. And yes, there's an acronym for it, CBIRF. So, and this is a battalion-sized unit, usually a little over 500 soldiers, that can be deployed to a terrorist incident anywhere in the world within 24 hours. So that's kind of an interesting thing, right? And the unit is stationed at the Naval Support Facility at Indian Head, Maryland. And again, it consists of Marines and Navy sailors representing over 40 different specialties. So this unit will assist, local, state, and federal agencies and military commanders when there is a credible threat of or an actual incident involving chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, or high-yield explosives. And again, the unit's capabilities include agent detection, meaning what is it that's been expelled? Is it biological, radiological, etc. Emergency medical care, stabilization of contaminated personnel, and of course consequent management. And depending upon the facts and of the situation or the incident, this unit could also come underneath the command of NORTHCOM. So while you don't really see it under NORTHCOM, depending upon the incident type, it could actually fall up underneath NORTHCOM. All right, so that's going to basically cover a lot of information relating to anti-terrorism. All right, and if we, just kind of take a second and we go back, remember, anti-terrorism, defensive actions taken to reduce the vulnerability of people and property to terrorist acts, but including rapid containment by local military and civilian forces. But remember, there's also a little proactive component to it, right? All right, so now we're going to kind of do an overview or have an overview of counterterrorism. We're going to get into that a little bit more. So now that we've talked enough about anti-terrorism. So, counterterrorism. Counterterrorism includes a broad range, or you could probably use the word constellation if you wanted to, of strategies, such as denying the rationale for terrorism and promoting other more attractive ideas, such as reducing the flow of recruits by providing them with alternative futures, strengthening the economies of failing nations to eliminate terrorist sanctuaries, interdicting materials, weapons, and supplies that are intended to be used by terrorists. And when you talk about interdicting, that means to basically intercept, if you will. Impounding funds in transit to terrorists. Implementing civil action programs. And then, of course, direct military action. So we have all of these different types of counterterrorism strategies, right? And while many of these activities we talked a little bit, we touched on in earlier chapters, we're going to kind of focus now on combating terrorism through the use of specially trained military and law enforcement counterterrorism units. And many of these units are going to fall under the umbrella of what we call the Joint Special Operations Command within SOCOM. And yes, I know there's a million acronyms, right? So here is the model. Just like we had kind of an anti-terrorism model, here's the counterterrorism model. And this basically depicts a variety of actions, including eroding support for violent extremist organizations, disrupting their plans, and countering support for them. So you can find this chart on page 397 in your textbook at the top. All right, so we're going to start off talking about counterterrorism and different forms of military action. So in contrast to anti-terrorism, counterterrorism is characterized by direct actions. Remember, it's more offensive or offensive, I guess would be a better way to say that. And again, typically done by the military to prevent, deter, and respond to terrorists. Now, a key component is to identify, locate, and take action against high-value human targets to disrupt the terrorist intentions, capabilities, and their operations. So, and again, this is stuff that's typically going to be carried out by different military units. So some examples, and it kind of falls underneath the heading of what we're going to call open warfare. So, examples could be the first Gulf War in 1991, triggered by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And as a preemptive action, the United States and its allies basically returned to Iraq to conduct kind of open warfare. And although special operation units were also active, searching for, some of, Saddam Hussein, etc., after we gained control of the country, the U.S. spent billions of dollars on training and equipping Iraqi police. So, and their military in order to foster a stable government. So that's one example of counterterrorism. In 2014, the terrorist group Islamic State basically exploited long-standing conflicts between Sunni and Shia populations in Iraq and began military operations against the government of Iraq, raising questions of whether the U.S. and their allies, left Iraq too soon. And those are kind of things to basically, think about when we talk about that. Again, in early 2017, it was clear that the Afghanistan Army and the contingent of U.S. military forces left in the country had kind of reached a stalemate with Al-Qaeda, and newly arrived, IS fighters and the Taliban. So the commander of the U.S. forces requested additional, troops. And we talked a little bit about some of those deployments in Chapter 1. So another term that you're going to want to kind of understand that falls underneath counterterrorism would be something called raids. Now, raids may be executed to do a number of things, to take prisoners, to gather intelligence. They could be punitive or for other purposes. An example of raids could be in 1998, President Clinton ordered missile strikes in the Sudan and Afghanistan in reaction to the bombings of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And when we talk about, strikes and things like that, what comes to mind also under counterterrorism is going to be the phrase preemptive strike. So a preemptive strike or a preemptive military action is the striking of a target in advance of a reasonable anticipated attack in order to circumvent its occurrence, to stop it from happening, right? And to avoid suffering its effects. And you can see on the chart, there's kind of a split. So this is an interesting chart. This is the U.S. is split over possible North Korea military action. And there's arguments against a preemptive strike and arguments for. So, and these are tough decisions because, it'd be like anything else. Do you wait for somebody to fire the shot? Or if you have really good information that the shot is coming anyway, should you preemptively strike yourself before they have a chance to do something to you? Does that kind of make sense? That's kind of making it to where we could probably all understand. So that is called preemptive military action. Now, during the Cold War era, roughly 1947 to 1991, the Russians and Americans did not fight a hot war, if you will, but they were ideologically opposed, which played itself out in situations like the Soviet isolation of East Berlin and their support of regimes opposed to the United States and its allies. And because both Russia and the United States had numerous nuclear missiles, warfare really did not erupt because of a phrase that we're going to learn now, and again, it falls under counterterrorism. A phrase called mutually assured destruction would be the result. So what is this kind of new word that we're learning? So mutually assured destruction basically says that an all-out nuclear war would effectively destroy both sides if you were talking about the U.S. and Russia, or both entities. And again, this kind of came up in the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And in 2001, a preemption, if you will, was used to justify the American attack on Afghanistan. And I have a couple of interesting videos on nuclear war and what we call preemptive strikes, and whether or not we should launch a nuclear attack, when that might happen, and how do you actually do that. So I have two different videos, one titled Nuclear War 1, Nuclear War 2. You can watch those and get a better understanding. Just understand that the term mutually assured destruction means that basically nobody's going to win, because this all-out nuclear war is going to basically wipe out both sides. So kind of continuing on a little bit, terrorists have no nation or citizens to defend, and as a result, then George W. Bush announced a major shift in American foreign policy: the right to take preemptive military action to protect the U.S. and its citizens and interests. And that's why I talked about in 2001 this preemption, right? was used to justify the American attack on Afghanistan, which had been harboring, Al-Qaeda terrorists and also Osama bin Laden for a long time, and also before and after 9/11, right? And the second Gulf War, 2003 to about 2011, was also considered a preemptive action in the belief that Iraq's Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and would, of course, use them against the United States, or arm the terrorist with those weapons of mass destructions for an attack on the U.S. So that's kind of a summary, if you will, on preemptive strike and mutually assured destruction. Okay, so another thing that falls underneath combating terrorism would be what we call direct action. So the United States has used direct action to eliminate leaders of terrorist organizations in order to disrupt their plans and operations. And two examples from 2011 can kind of illustrate the point. The first example would be a drone attack, or a drone that attacked a convoy in Yemen and killed American-born Anwar al-Awlaki, an important al-Qaeda figure. And coincidentally, Samir Khan, a naturalized American citizen who basically operated the Jihad internet magazine, was also killed in that same attack. And then example two would be Osama bin Laden, who was killed at his compound in Pakistan by Navy SEALs. Now, it's not publicly known, if his death was a tactical necessity. Arguably, if captured, he may have, right, divulged significant intelligence. But if put on trial, bin Laden would have had a kind of a commanding venue from which to justify Al-Qaeda's actions, meaning he could have got up there and talked more about his group and why they did what they did, kind of like give him center stage. But this is one of the bigger examples of using direct action to eliminate a leader, would be the killing of Osama bin Laden by the Navy SEALs. And if you want to read a book about it, it's actually really, really cool. I've read it. It's called No Easy Day by Mark Owen. And I have a picture of the book right there. So another thing that kind of falls again under combating terrorism and counterintelligence would be hostage rescues. Now, historically, there are a number of incidences where highly trained military units attempted to or did rescue hostages. The rescue of Captain Richard Phillips from those Somali pirates illustrated this point. I believe it was 2009, Somali pirates hijacked the cargo from the Merrick, Alabama in the Indian Ocean. And the pirates held that American captain, Richard Phillips, hostage basically in a covered lifeboat and threatened to kill him unless they were given $2 million. Now, the FBI Crisis Negotiation Unit maintained communication with the pirates in order to kind of keep the situation diffused, if you will. And hostage and crisis negotiation teams performed a variety of different things during, this terrorist incident. A Navy SEAL team parachuted onto the ocean, over the horizon, and basically moved to a Navy ship without the pirates actually noticing. And the captain, as well as the three pirates, again, were in this 18-foot hard-covered lifeboat in the open sea. And when it seemed like the captain was going to be killed, when he was in really imminent danger, one of the SEAL team snipers basically got the green light, which means it was okay to shoot. And all three pirates in the lifeboat were killed, and the captain was rescued and unharmed. And there was one other pirate that was treated for some injuries, and then he was basically convicted in court. So 3 out of the 4 of those individuals were killed. So, with that said, much of the war on terrorism is fought with special military operations as opposed to, your standardized, kind of conventional forces, if you will. And federal law is going to dictate which units have a primary counterterrorism, mission. So the next, slides that we go through in our discussions, we're going to look at the different military units that are basically designated to conduct these counterterrorism operations. So we'll spend just a little bit of time on those units, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. So first would be the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. So the CIA was established by the National Security Act of 1947. And fundamentally, this act directed the CIA to collect, analyze, and disseminate intelligence. And although conducting, secret, covert operations was not specifically authorized, the language of the act was sufficiently flexible that the CIA soon began, becoming involved in these types of operations. And America's Office of Strategic Service had been quickly disbanded following the end of World War II. However, the federal government substantially preserved the OSS Secret Intelligence and Counter-Espionage branches, which later joined the newly minted CIA, giving the agency the ability and a wealth of covert activity experience kind of right from the get-go. So again, established in 1947, initially to collect, analyze, and disseminate intel. Through that, we have the formation of the Office of Strategic Services, and branches of the Secret Intelligence and Counter-Espionage Group. They kind of merged with the CIA, which kind of made them one big organization, if you will, and aided in, the CIA's ability to do covert operations. So there's that information. And then there's also another unit within the CIA called the Special Activities Division. And an acronym again, SAD, is a group of paramilitary officers within the CIA which conduct clandestine, or behind the scenes, undercover, non-noticeable missions, secret, even if you want to use that word, to include counterterrorism and capture or kill missions. And capture mission is exactly what it sounds like. You go out and capture someone. A kill mission is the same thing. You go out and you kill someone. And basically, the Special Activities Division, or SAD, augmented the Delta Force and the SEAL teams in the infiltration into Afghanistan. We have the FBI Hostage Rescue Team. So as we talked a little bit about in Chapter 9, the FBI is the lead agency in more than 119 joint terrorism task forces that are spread across the country. And their membership, again, if you remember, consists of federal agencies such as Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement from the Department of Homeland Security, as well as officers from state and local law enforcement agencies. And the mission, again, of the Joint Terrorism Task Forces are to investigate, detect, interdict, prosecute, and remove terrorists and dismantle or take apart their organizations. So really less well known is the FBI's involvement in military counterterrorism raids in foreign countries. But there are. And one example would be in 2014, Ahmed Abu Katahala was arrested in Libya by a combined unit consisting of Delta operators and FBI agents on outstanding felony warrants for his role in the 2012 attack on the American consulate compound in Benghazi, Libya. And basically he was considered to be the alleged mastermind of that particular attack. So here's the FBI hostage rescue team. Next, we have the U.S. Special Operations Command. So the Special Operations Command was formed in 1987 and is headquartered at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. And its mission is to provide fully capable special operation forces to defend the United States and its interests and to synchronize global military operations against terrorist networks. So essentially SOCOM, which is Special Operations Command, so it's U.S. SOCOM, or SOCOM for short. I know, 1,000 acronyms again. This SOCOM is the parent organization for the Special Operations community, and it's composed of special warfare elements from various branches of the military. And again, it's important to remember that the Joint Special Operations Command is also a subordinate command of SOCOM, but I really just want you to understand what SOCOM is. So here is kind of a chart. It's on page 403 in your textbook, and it shows, this is U.S. SOCOM, or SOCOM for short, and underneath it are all these specialist groups. You have the U.S. Army Special Operations, you have the Naval Special Warfare, you have the Air Force Special Ops, you have the Joint Special Operation Command, and you have the U.S. Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command. So this is what falls underneath SOCOM. So now we're going to talk about a couple of other groups, the first being the U.S. Army Special Forces, or the Green Berets. And if you watch any TV shows, etc., there's actually a movie with John Wade called The Green Berets. Okay, anyway, and it's really old and you probably don't remember. So the U.S. Army Special Forces was created in 1952 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And Colonel Aaron Banks became its first commander and is regarded as the father of special forces, if you will. And part of, when we talk about the Army Special Forces, was something called the Loge Act of 1950. And this basically allowed about 2,500 alien, meaning not registered individuals into this country, if you will, men to gain citizenship if they served 5 years of service in the Army. And most of these 2,500, if you will, were from European countries where the berets were very common to wear. And as a result, that's kind of how it morphed into where the U.S. Army Special Forces became the Green Berets. So the Green Berets became the official headwear of the Special Forces, the Green Berets, if you will, in 1961. And Special Forces were, of course, heavily, involved in the Vietnam War, providing intelligence for air and missile strikes. Special Forces were among the earliest units on the ground in Iraq, and they were also involved in counterterrorism activities in Afghanistan. Next would be the U.S. Army Delta Force. So, in 1977, Lieutenant Colonel Beckwith created the Delta Force, which was kind of a secret special operations force. And a lot of times you kind of giggle a little bit because a lot of folks will basically deny its existence. So the secrecy surrounding Delta is such that the U.S. government routinely denies that it kind of exists. Still a limited number of missions assigned to Delta by the U.S. Special Operations Command, have become public, over the years. A couple of those would be the Battle of Mogadishu in Somalia, where the warlord did what was an obstacle in restoring Somalia's national government, and he needed to be basically removed. Remember, we talked about those different types of operations. And if you kind of remember when we talked about preemptive strikes, we talked about, you know, whether someone was to be killed or captured or something like that. So whether it was a kill mission or a kind of a kidnap or a taking type mission. And then another thing that the Delta Force is highly remembered over would be the movie Black Hawk Down. And that kind of covers the raid and the battle. And if you've never seen the movie Black Hawk Down, you really should. It's an extremely emotional and very well put together movie. Next would be the U.S. Navy SEAL teams. So these individuals evolved out of separate out of 4 separate organizations during World War II. The first would be the Amphibious Scouts and Raiders. The second was the Navy Combat Demolition Unit. The third was the Underwater Demolition Unit. And then the last was the Office of Strategic Service. And like other elite special operations, type units, members basically volunteer, and then really they pass one of the most rigorous, or they don't pass, selection courses in the armed forces that's ever been brought about. So becoming a Navy SEAL, if you've ever watched any videos on how they train, it's just unbelievably brutal. And those in the selection course for the 75th Ranger Regiment say, on a slab or with the tab, meaning that they will either die trying or earn the slender gold and black Ranger tab that they get. And for aspiring SEALs, the phrase is basically the only easy day was yesterday. So it was just a kind of a brutal training program. And some examples of the SEALs would be the Korean War, when UDT provided detailed information and used explosives. A lot of these different UDT teams were kind of rebadged or remarked again as U.S. Navy SEALs. And if you want to know where SEALs came from, here's how it kind of started. So it was rebranded in 1962. So you look at Navy SEALs. So they're going to take here sea, air, land. And that's SEAL. Kind of makes sense, right? All right, and SEAL Team 6 basically represents the apex, the top rung, the top group, if you will, of a counterterrorism unit. And this is the unit that completed the raid and ultimately killed Osama bin Laden. And it's referred to as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. But this is SEAL Team 6, and there is a picture on the lower right of their little logo. And their mission is basically direct warfare action. Remember, we talked about direct, right? Going and doing something. Special reconnaissance. Unconventional warfare, meaning it's not fought like a normal war. Foreign defense strengthening and counterterrorism operations. Next, we'll take a look quickly at the U.S. Army, the 75th Ranger Regiment. So, kind of a cool thing. Rangers have a long and distinguished military history. In New England during 1675 and 1678, Captain Church led a company of Rangers to fight against Native Americans led by King Philip, as he was called by the colonists. Rangers also, they kind of reappeared during World War II, and they were named Darby's Rangers after their leader. The Korean War also signaled a need for the Rangers, and you can see their logo to the right there. The 75th Ranger Regiment was basically reorganized in 1969 to consolidate units for the Vietnam War. And the 75th Ranger Regiment has taken part in every major combat operation since the Vietnam War. There are basically 3 regiments as it relates to the 75th Ranger Regiment. So there are 3 regiments, 2 in Georgia and 1 in Washington. Their mission would be, again, direct action to seize, destroy, or capture enemy facilities and/or materials, airport seizure, special reconnaissance, personnel recovery, clandestine insertion to surprise the opponent, meaning like you can't see them, so it's secret, sensitive site exploitation, and they really don't have a specific counterterrorism mission, but almost everything that we mention here can kind of fall into counterterrorism. Okay, so as we're getting towards the end of our lecture, I want to talk a little bit about something called low-intensity conflict. Now, across the world, the challenge of confronting terrorism has resulted in many governments creating special units. And military action against terrorists is referred to as low-intensity conflict because it is somewhere between the diplomatic or economic tensions that flare up between countries and open conventional warfare between them. However, there's nothing low intensity for people who are killed by terrorists or have to risk their lives fighting against them. Okay, so we want to finish up with a couple of foreign counterterrorism organizations, just briefly. So there are basically 3, and there's more, but we're going to look at 3 allied nations counterterrorism organizations. First, we have the British Special Air Service, SAS. We have Germany's CH14, and then we have Israel's Saret Makal and CH14 and Mustarvim. Okay, so let's take a look at these real quick. So SAS is responsible for counterterrorism, intelligence gathering, forward air control, behind enemy lines sabotage, close protection, and training foreign militaries. They were involved, of course, in D-Day in 1944. SAS units cut rail lines in southern France to prevent German supplies from being brought to the front. And of course, they were involved in other things as well. In 2005 to 2008, the SAS partnered with U.S. Army Special Forces Delta and took over 18 months, and over 18 months, took 3,500 insurgents off the street. Now we'll talk a little bit about the Germany GSG-9, established after the 1972 terrorist attacks at the Olympics in Germany. It's one of the elite counterterrorism groups in the world, and it focuses mainly on hostage rescue. This group freed German hostages held on a plane in Somalia by Palestinian terrorists. When we talk about Israel, we have the Saret Matal, or Makal, depends how you kind of want to pronounce it. It's Israel's most secretive and respected counterterrorism unit. It's basically compared to our America's Delta Force. You have the CH14, which is comparable to our Navy SEALs. And then you have the Mustarvim, which is a secretive undercover counterterrorism unit attached to the Israeli border guard. And they really, for this group, you have to be fluent in Arabic. and are also required to live and pass as an Arab, because you're going to be along the border. And again, if you look at a map of Israel and you see all of the enemy countries, at least enemy of Israel, surrounding them, you're going to need to kind of blend in. So this group is kind of, they blend in and they're very undercover. And just to kind of give you an idea of how they work, and then we'll finish up here, is that when I was over in Israel doing some training, I had a chance to go over to Israel and do some training with the Mossad and some other groups over there, and some counterterrorism training, etc. This particular group, the Mista Arvim, they would be basically stationed several blocks out from, let's say, a large mall. So in Tel Aviv, where I was staying, they have like a big 3-4 story mall. It's huge. And they would have, of course, guards, and they would screen vehicles coming in and out for explosive devices and ask for papers, and all the normal stuff, because of the possibility of car bombs and people carrying explosives and different types of terrorism acts. But undercover, they would have these officers 1 or 2 blocks away from the actual mall, walking around, blending in with people, just looking at them and looking for anything unconventional. So it was actually really, really cool. Anyway, that's the Mista Arvim. Okay, so we did manage to make it just a hair over 60 minutes, so I apologize for that, but we were able to squeeze in a lot of good content. So with that will conclude our Chapter 14 lecture on combating terrorism.